Welcome, everyone, to episode 18 of the Argument Clinic podcast. I'm your mostly lovely podcast host, Martin, and I am here with my other consistent and entirely lovely podcast host, Lawrence. How are you doing, lovely Lawrence?
Doing pretty good. How about yourself?
Would you say that you're doing lovely?
No,
Are you full of love, Lawrence?
no.
That's good. I love to hear that. I think you're lovely, Lawrence, and don't let anyone tell you that you're not lovely, especially yourself. Um, okay, so for those of you who are just tuning in, this is a LD Fundamentals podcast, emphasis on fun. Um, in this podcast, we will talk about the basics of Lincoln Douglas debate, but also the advanced concepts. And we'll do that through sharing core skills, whether you're a seasoned veteran of the tournament scene, some novice moseying on up to their first debate ever, a debate coach in a school who was looking to improve the Lincoln Douglas curriculum for the rest of their team, or just some casual joker that likes to joke around making jokes and having some jokes, that likes to listen to the stupid jokes that I make. This is the podcast for you. Now, Lawrence, I know that this past weekend, you and I were in the same place. So you want to spill the beans on where that was?
Oh yeah, we were both in the lovely sunny place of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Actually, the place that we first met a year ago. Well, not for the first time, but to discuss
Yeah.
the creation of this podcast. So,
It's true. It was conceived on some random table in the
I,
center
I,
of
I
the
can actually tell you
library.
which table it was.
It was it the middle one?
Yeah. Because I was sitting at that table for the round robin, or for part of the round robin.
I will say to the listeners that that wasn't that hard of a guess because there are only three. So I think it was the middle one, but can't be sure. Um, okay, so yeah, we were at the Minneapolis tournament, judging it away. And Lawrence, what was your favorite round you judged? Don't tell me anything about the content. Just tell me about, like, I don't know, like what, like, how great were their, like, how much did they persuade you?
Uh, the favorite round probably wasn't one that I judged, but one that I heard about from all of the peoples, and which throughout this debate there was, for some reason, a debate about whose Uber ratings were better, and I wish I had been judging that round.
So you can evaluate people's Uber ratings.
Yeah, I think it's an important debate to have.
That makes one of us. Okay, so we on this episode of the podcast have a guest that we'll reveal at the end of at the beginning of the next segment. Before we do that, want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Victory Briefs. Victory Briefs has had a great hand in the Minneapolis tournament and the successful running of that. One of the heads of that tournament, Chris Tice, received an distinguished alumni award from Pam Wyckoff. It was really touching. Victory Briefs is full of excellent people that care about the quality of the kids at the camp, and they make sure that there's the best curricular experience possible. So if you're in the market for a great Victory Briefs camp, if you're in the market for a good debate camp, you should sign up for Victory Briefs. I guess if you're in the market for a Victory Briefs camp, you should also sign up for Victory Briefs, obviously. And Lawrence loves Victory Briefs very much. He loves Victory Briefs the same amount that he is lovely. Is that true, Lawrence?
That could be true.
It could be true. I'll take it. So this episode is a choreography episode. Those episodes, for those of you that don't know, are the episodes where we walk through the mechanics. How do you plot out arguments in rounds? How do you say those things that allow you to win rounds? This is distinct from scholarship and art of war and stuff like that. For life cycle episodes, we talk about stuff kind of outside of the tournament and how that works. For Art of War episodes, we talk about strategy and how you go about figuring out what you're supposed to do before debates and, like, figuring out which types of arguments to talk about. Obviously, this isn't a scholarship episode where we just learn things about things. This episode is a choreography episode. Once you're in the debate and have to actually make arguments and win rounds, how do you do that? So this episode, we are focusing on impact weighing. We'll discuss what that is shortly, but this is a great topic, and we have a great guest to accompany it. So when we come back, we're going to get right into our guest and right into what is weighing. Welcome to our special guest for this episode that most of you already know because, of course, you looked at the show notes in the introduction. Welcome, Nelson Okunlola. How are you, Nelson?
I'm doing great. How are you, Martin?
I'm glorious. And Lawrence is lovely, right, Lawrence?
Sure.
Sure has been called. So, Nelson, I know you had a great career yourself. I don't know a ton about it. I do know that you got 15th speaker at the Tournament of Champions last year, which is really an amazing feat among some of the best debaters in the country. So, can you just tell me a bit about your debate background, kind of like where you started, where you went to high school, all that jazz?
Yeah, so I was an independent debater for Earl Warren High School, which is, I guess, in terms of the national circuit, it's a small school located in San Antonio, Texas. I pretty much started debate in my junior year in high school, and I started circuit debate in my senior year in high school. And yeah, I guess my career isn't necessarily over. I currently attend Northwestern University, and I am on the policy debate team, and I am a second negative speaker.
Ooh, you're the 2N. I actually follow you guys at tournaments. I don't know if you knew that. I always follow all the former LDers when they do policy debate.
Oh, did you follow Nelson at Kentucky?
Yeah, I don't remember his record though.
Oh, well, it's not the record that's important. The record, it's important that Nelson and I debated at that tournament.
Oh, you did tell me that, and we can of course discuss that in detail off air. But our two podcast, my two co-hosts here have really gone at it against each other in what, by all accounts, was a very entertaining debate. Okay, so thank you very much for coming on, Nelson, especially on such short notice. So let's get, sorry, what?
My pleasure.
Okay. So let's get right into the thick of things. The way that we're gonna do the podcast is in the first segment we're gonna talk about what is weighing and why should you do it. In the second main segment, we're going to talk about sort of how you do it, and then the third segment is going to be sort of how does it sound when you do it, what are the specific words that you say, and then how can you hone the skills that are associated with weighing. So I guess my first question, I'll just ask this to Lawrence. Lawrence, in very basic terms, what is weighing? When I say that someone has weighed an argument or someone needs to do more weighing, what is that?
In short, I would call weighing comparison, or just like a fancy way for comparing arguments and comparing impacts of arguments.
Okay, so Nelson, we had a previous episode, I'm not sure you're aware, on evidence comparison. So evidence comparison, of course, you're still comparing arguments, but it's not quite the same thing as the weighing thing that we're talking about. And can you help our listeners kind of understand the difference? So when you're weighing versus doing evidence comparison, what exactly are you comparing?
Sure. So I guess I can start with the similarity. I guess, like you've stated earlier, it is similar in a sense that you are doing a comparative analysis between two different concepts. In terms of evidence, you're comparing the credibility of each other's evidence. In terms of weighing generally, or more specifically, impact weighing, you're more doing a comparative analysis between the two impacts that have been introduced in the round. I guess something that sort of distinguishes the two is that impact weighing is a bit more structured in a sense that there are set guidelines and set procedures or set manners that you should weigh between different impacts, whereas evidence comparison is a bit more open-ended.
A bit more open-ended. Definitely true. So 100% agree. Comparison of impacts specifically. So so Lawrence, when I'm doing weighing, what are the kinds of things? When I say I'm comparing impacts, can you just kind of put that in concrete terms? So let's say you're debating that the current resolution, and someone has a value criterion of maximizing welfare, and they have a contention that says that development assistance helps. There are statistics that show that development assistance helps raise third world countries out of poverty. And then on the negative, there's an argument that says that development assistance causes corruption and hurts the environment because aid is misused. So if I wanted to compare the parts of those arguments in terms of weighing, how would I do that?
Right. So unlike Sort of.
let's say, I'm sorry, let's just say that we're the affirmative in this case.
Oh, okay. I think I remember what you said. So unlike a direct refutation to an argument, which attempts to prove that that argument is untrue or that there are faults in that argument, weighing will, to some degree, assume the truth of an argument and explain why a competing argument should occupy a higher position when the judge is trying to decide which argument is more important. So you can think of it about sort of prioritization. So say we're affirmative in this example. What did we say that the affirmative was doing? Like the negative was saying that it caused corruption?
Poverty.
Yeah, the affirmative reduces poverty. The negative argues that it causes corruption. Well, you could attack it and say the negative's argument about corruption and say, no, it doesn't really cause corruption. In fact, the affirmative actually might be maybe even better at dealing with corruption or something like that. But assume at the end of the debate that these are the two arguments that the judge has to evaluate. And so you have to compare these arguments in a meaningful sense. And you might have to explain why, even if your opponent wins, that it does cause corruption, that the reduction of poverty should be of greater importance when the judge is trying to make a decision. And in the next section, we'll talk about like a few specific ways in which we can do that. But for example, one thing you could say is that even if it does cause corruption, that it's more important in the short term to save as many lives as possible who are dying as a result of not having aid. And that aid that reduces poverty is more important than that marginal amount of corruption that increases as a result.
Yeah. So love all the stuff that you both are saying. You know, it's not so. Nelson, I wanted to ask you a question about some stuff that Lauren said, and in many ways, this question is sort of like not fair, but I don't expect like a statistical analysis or whatever. But I'm just wondering, like, how often do you think that the affirmative / negative wins that their contentions that they have access to the impacts in their contentions? Just like what is like the percentage of the time that the affirmative reads like a contention and kind of like wins it in a truth sense versus like the negative?
I would say that so maybe more on an objective sense, I would say the affirmative probably wins their impacts a bit more often than the negative in terms of truth. In terms of truth of the argument, I would say maybe if you wanted me to give you a statistic, I'd say maybe the affirmative wins their impact. I guess 55% of the time, and the negative wins their impact about 45% of the time.
Well, so maybe I should make the question a little clearer. So what I'm not talking about the probability that the neg wins that their contention like outweighs the affirmatives. My question is like, how often do you think the affirmative wins that they get access to their impact?
Well, in that sense, I would say probably around 70% of the time.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think that's a good number. And I think that number, so like that number is also kind of high for the negative too, right?
I would say a bit higher for the negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, well, I mean, maybe this is what you're about to say is that like a lot of the times the affirmative doesn't have a huge amount of time to deal with a negative contention.
Definitely.
So given that those facts are true, right? If you think about that, that's actually kind of staggering, right? That the affirmative wins their contention 70% of the time. I think that's a very good number. And the negative would probably win it 80% of the time. So if that's true, as one side, you really have to think about what happens if your opponent does win their impact or that they win access to the impact. It really happens so often. The affirmative has a ton of time in their case to develop their impacts, and the affirmative doesn't have that much time to address the negatives. So, Nelson, correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, like the situation that happens is a lot of the time, both sides win access to their impacts.
Definitely,
that just happens.
Yeah, which I'm guessing what you're going to say next is this really highlights the importance of impact comparison, because if you're in a situation when both sides are winning both of their impacts, the judge still inevitably has to decide on a winner. So it's not enough just to win your impact.
Exactly.
Hey.
Boom. 10 out of 10. That's exactly where I was going. You know, like I think this just like happens so many times that I think so. Like this is one of the key things that I want us to get out of all this. People who are listening is that you should not be so confident that you will definitively disprove everything that your opponent says. This is debate, not you don't have to win every argument to win a debate. And in fact, you should be, acutely aware of the fact that there will be a lot of arguments in debate that you will lose, but still win the debate. You have to be prepared to win, even if you lose, even if your opponent wins that their contention is right. And weighing is the way that you do that. Weighing kind of helps, because if both sides win that, if I win that development assistance decreases poverty and Lawrence wins that development assistance increases corruption, that is a situation that could just happen a bunch of the time. And if that's true, then the winner of that debate will be the one that proves that their impact is more important, that it is a more important thing to address. Lawrence, you've judged a lot of times. At one point, you kept some insane Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, no, I just updated it, so that way when you click on the name of the person that I judged, it takes you to the tab room link.
Jesus Christ, Lawrence. That is absolutely ridiculous.
I was really bored during one round of the Apple Valley tournaments. I was just like, time to
You're
update
just like
everything.
outing yourself as a bad judge too.
I made the right decision in that round.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah. So yes. As I was just criticizing Lawrence for being a ridiculous human being, he then just proves that he's even more ridiculous than I previously thought.
I still need to update like the first 2 years that I've judged, but yeah.
You let me, Lawrence. You should really trust me on this. You really don't need to do that.
But I want to. It's key to my value to life. Anyways, yes, I've judged a lot of rounds. What next?
Yeah. So you have judged a lot of rounds. How many rounds, like percentage-wise, do you think come down to, and I use this term loosely, weighing?
99% of them.
99% has got to be way too much, but like
no, I mean like
it's probably like 91%.
Okay, maybe I don't know, but like unless like there's just a straight conceded argument, and even then that still is a form of weighing, anyways. No, like I actually think that virtually every round comes down to some form of weighing. Like because the way that I make decisions is I attempt to construct one for each side, and it's the one that I think is most consistent with the round arguments made by each debater, and then requires the least amount of my input into the decision is the one that I choose. And inevitably, since I use that method to make decisions, I have to resort to weighing. Like I can't not use like look at weighing in my decision.
I mean, I don't know about 99%, but like it's at least 90%.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
So Nelson, I'm not that much aware of like how often you've judged, because you just graduated this past year, right?
Yeah, I did.
So have you judged a bunch?
Not really. I've judged at one tournament. I do plan on increasing my frequency of judging, but
Well, you're debating all the time, right?
Yeah, I'm open competing too.
So like that's why. But so like have you kind of noticed like the weighing thing when you're judging, that it's just like a lot about weighing?
Yeah, weighing definitely comes into play a majority of debate rounds and in the majority of decisions, and not necessarily even from a judging perspective, but both from a previous competitor and a current competitor in college policy debate. Weighing is very, very important.
Yeah, it's so unbelievably important. So one reason that, so I think that everyone or most people really understand that weighing is important.
Well, actually, I'll interject a little bit here, which is I think that a lot of younger debaters assume that their judge sees everything through their perspective.
I was literally right about to get to that. Exactly. Perfect. So I was saying, I think that a lot of debaters realize like that weighing is like kind of important, but when push comes to shove, the exact thing that you're describing happens.
Yeah.
So can you actually expand on that now that I've
so like younger debaters just assume, and actually probably a lot of debaters just assume that the judge sees everything the way that they are seeing it around. They're like when they're debating in the middle of giving the 2AR, they're just like, I'm obviously correct about all of this. But the judge doesn't do that. Like they can't just see everything from the perspective of the AF or just the perspective of the neg. They have to evaluate the round from an external, supposedly neutral perspective. And like, if you don't do weighing and just assume that the judge sees everything through your lens, I mean, the judge has literally no idea how to resolve this. And as a judge, when I judge at local tournaments, I think the lack of weighing is the number one thing that irks me about these debates, because each debater just so assumes that they're obviously correct about everything and gives me no way to compare their arguments versus their opponents. And then inevitably I'm forced to do that for them. And one of them is not happy afterwards because they're like, they didn't see things my way. And it's like, I mean, I have to evaluate both of your arguments. And it's just really frustrating because in a lot of these local rounds, it just seems like two ships sort of passing in the night where each of them, assuming that they're correct, is like, I don't need to explain anything or compare anything.
Are you irked?
Yes.
Do you often irk in your spare time?
Just when I'm judging local debates where people don't weigh.
Fair enough. Irking is a hobby for Lawrence. He does it on the side. Yeah, so 100% agree, and I believe, by the way, that this illusion is quickly dispelled when you have to judge at all.
Yeah, like just judge some rounds and then realize like how difficult it is.
And then you're just like, oh, both of these debaters think they're totally right.
They're just like, it's so obvious that my opponent's second contention is false. And it's like, no, it's not. Like, are you kidding me? Like,
oh man, yeah. Like Nelson, I'm sure. Have you ever had to like work with novices? Yeah, help them improve and stuff.
I actually also, because I was the captain of my team last year, so I had to extensively with novices. I also coached the middle school team. Oh God, that was fun.
Oh, middle schoolers are something else. Let me tell you, I have to work with a lot of them as well. Indeed. Okay, so I want to just also quickly discuss a different form of why weighing is important. So I want to talk about not just like, so what we've been mostly talking about is judges making technical decisions in debates, right? Just like how hard it would be if you wanted to figure out where all of the arguments actually fell, like where did everything really resolve itself? Then of course it's hard to win rounds without weighing. But I also think, and Lawrence, you're probably a good person to ask about this. I also think that weighing is really important, if not even more important, for judges that do not have an intimate understanding of the technical proceedings of debates, which is honestly most of the judges that we're likely to get at most of our local tournaments.
yeah.
And one thing that I sort of want to say is, and I think you're going to be pretty on board with this, but like, if you never explain why your impact, like what your impact means, like what do you think your chances are of like winning a normal local tournament debate?
About like 50-50.
Yeah, that's really bad for those of you who are listening at home. 50-50 means your effect on the outcome of the debate is the same as if you flipped a coin.
Flipping a coin isn't exactly 50-50, but sure, the idea stands.
I am, I'm gonna do a first on this podcast, and I'm not gonna go down a tangent. I'm not gonna go down the tangent on that. So yeah, coin flipping 50-50, but yeah, like absolutely, like if you want to just leave the debate entirely to chance, just like don't say why your impacts are important, and then they won't, and then you're like, like it's good that I like paid money to come to this tournament to see like the result being decided entirely randomly by the judge. Like that's not good.
Yeah, and like I think it is really important because if you go outside of a debate sense, right? Like every argument has two sides to it, which is like kind of why it's an argument. And when you're just like debating something in the real world, like everything has a cost to it. And it's always a question of whether or not that cost is worth the benefit of the thing that of the thing that you want. So like every time you go to McDonald's, you have to consider that, the food that you get versus the sort of health that you lose and the money that you spend. And there's no way that in that debate, you're going to be like winning, that your opponent's argument is completely false. Because it'd be wrong if you said, you spend no money at McDonald's, or wrong if you said that there is no health consequences to going to McDonald's. But instead, you have to convince someone that at the end, those benefits sort of are greater than the cost, or the costs are greater than the benefits. And that requires weighing. And to people who aren't like debate technical people, like you really have to explain that to them. And you really have to explain why your arguments matter, and more importantly, why they matter more than your opponents. Because otherwise, it is literally just flipping a coin. If your judge thinks that your opponent's impacts are more important than yours, well, then you lose. So you don't really want to leave that up for chance, because these people are coming from not a debate background. They're coming from the real world, where it turns out you have to weigh everything.
Now, Nelson, as someone who is currently engaged with debate, you must like really just have your ears, tuned for weighing arguments. Yeah, go ahead.
In what sense?
Just like when someone fails to make a weighing argument, you gotta just like pump the fist, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
This is both in and out of debate. When you're having casual conversation or a casual money, and they bring up a perspective, but they fail to sort of like weigh and compare that with your perspective, you're just like, what's going on?
Do you just like expose them? You just like, you have failed to weigh your perspective. You lose.
Game over, issue, vote negative.
It is like kind of funny to imagine you doing that. that would be good. Just like exploding on your friends in like the dining hall for like failing to weigh their impacts.
No thanks. I'd like to keep the friends that I do have.
I'm sure that Lawrence weighing interrogates all of his friends' impacts.
You think I have friends?
Oh, that's because he weighed all of their impacts. He's like, you failed to weigh, and they're like, bye forever. Okay, so in this segment, we wanted to give you a sense of like impact weighing and what it is, and what we're going to be talking about. I wanted to talk about really quickly, and we did sort of some of this in previous episodes, but when I say impact weighing, now most of you, of course, know what an impact is. It's the consequence of something happening. So one thing that I want to mention is that like when you do impact weighing, Lawrence, what you're really doing is you're kind of like spelling out a bunch of stuff, because it might be easy to say, development assistance is good for the economy. But ultimately, if you don't explain why that is an important factor, then you sort of haven't really explained why your argument is important. You haven't really given it an impact. So weighing, to me, is kind of like spelling out the impact in really explicit terms. You just take the impact and you kind of like analyze it. You blow it up.
Yeah, and more importantly, analyze it relative to a competing argument, because you can't really weigh something like in a vacuum. It's all about sort of relative to something else.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't make sense. Although, as Nelson can probably confirm, like people do this all the time. People are like, "Oh, like poverty is the literal like worst thing that could ever happen to a human."
Yeah, which is like silly, because maybe like a few people in poverty might actually be a cost that is acceptable if the alternative is like a bunch of people actually dying from disease or something like that. So all of these things are relative to one another.
Yeah, for sure. Like people definitely try, but like you really, weighing has to be specific comparison. Okay, in our next segment, we will talk about what are the terms by which we can compare impacts, and how do we weigh on the basis of that. In this segment, we're going to talk about the ways that you compare impacts now that you all have it vitally burned into your heads that you have to do weighing. Please, dear God, do it, because if you don't, I will be sad and you might lose and be unhappy about it. So, so Nelson, I have written here the very first way to compare impacts is magnitude. In a very broad sense, what is magnitude?
Sure. In a very broad and simple sense, magnitude is simply the size or the immensity of an impact.
Okay. So an impact size. Now what so there are kind of two metrics by which we think about the size of an impact. So what are they?
Sure. So the two metrics that we use to think about the size of an impact are scope and severity. Scope refers to the extent or the extent of the area to which an impact covers. So for example, when thinking of an impact like global warming, obviously the scope would be the globe, hence global warming, because it affects everyone in the globe. When thinking about the impact of, let's say, criminal statutes in the United States, the scope would just be the United States. Next, we have severity, and this simply just refers to how bad or how devastating the impact would be if it were to occur to individuals.
So we have scope, which is how many people that the impact affects, which is kind of just like a number, right?
Yeah,
Right, Nelson. And then the severity, as far as I understand it, is like the kind of condition that is associated with that impact. Like, how does it actually affect somebody?
definitely. So this would simply be, for example, maybe something like poverty and literal death might affect individuals in different ways, or
Mhm.
things like criminal statutes and things like, uh, hmm, I guess maybe water shortages and food shortages also might affect individuals in different ways.
Mhm.
So all of these are issues of severity.
Okay, so Lawrence, I'm gonna kind of give you like two sort of like I'm gonna give you a situation of a low scope, high severity impact, and then if you could then after that give me an example of one that is low severity but high scope. So high severity, low scope might be that it results in sort of 5 people, let's say, being tortured. And that has a low scope because it doesn't affect that many people, but the severity of the people that it does affect is very significant. Or, for example, that maybe like in a debate applicable context, there is something that if it is done would kill people, but it would kill like 100 people. So, so that is a high severity but low scope impact. It's still very important because it is incredibly severe, but it also doesn't affect that many people. So, how about the flip side? What is a high scope, low severity impact?
A common example is just maybe a slight increase in taxes to fund something new. So it affects a lot of people, virtually every taxpayer, but the amount it affects them would be like cents, not even, and it'd be very tiny. So it affects everyone, but the amount it affects them is pretty low. And I think like a good theoretical example of this is just like a pinpricks example. So like a high scope low severity pinprick example would be 10,000 people getting slightly pricked with a needle that they don't really feel. Whereas a low scope, high severity one would be like 5 people, but they get like a nail through them and that would hurt uh, a
Oh
lot.
no. Oh no. The example that I always like to use is air pollution. It's like, air pollution affects a large number of people, but it also is usually not ever that bad for any one person. But yeah, I mean like
Unless you live in China.
pinpricks also. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty like high scope and like decently high severity impact um as well. So Nelson, if I wanted to figure out the total magnitude of an impact, and I know the scope and I know the severity, what's the kind of like mathematical calculation that I need to do?
Sure. So you just take the derivative of the scope and you multiply that by the integral of the severity.
Oh no. You said the calculus words and now I'm defeated. That's actually the only way to banish me. I'm just a demon person, and I just get instantly banished if someone uses calculus words.
So in terms of like an actual answer, there is not necessarily an explicit mathematical calculation, but if you want to think about it conceptually, it would be sort of a multiplication problem. So you would just be not really multiplication, but you'd be taking into account both the scope and the severity of that, because there's not because when you are sort of adjudicating between different impacts that might have different sort of ways of quantifying them. So for example, you can't necessarily, there's no way to, there's not necessarily a metric to quantify like the disadvantages of taxes or in comparison to the disadvantages of like torture. So it would just be you taking both of those conditions into account while making your comparative analysis.
Definitely. And I mean, severity is qualitative, right? It relates to kind of like your personal life quality. So there, of course, is not like exact measures of it. But I definitely agree that like there is kind of like a multiplication element to it, right? Like if you wanted to figure out how bad something was, you take the number of people that experience it and multiply how bad it is for those people.
Exactly.
And it does like that kind of makes sense. And of course, like, can you really know all the time how bad a certain thing is for everyone? Like, no. But like, you can guesstimate. So I would say personally that magnitude is one of the most important kinds of weighing. Would you agree with that, or would you disagree? We welcome disagreement on this podcast as much as agreement, of course.
I'm actually inclined to think that probability might be a little bit more important. Mostly because I think in most debate rounds, both impacts are relatively high magnitude, but it's a question of their relative probabilities. Now, in the context of maybe more local rounds, I suppose, maybe I might care about magnitude a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It seems like in a lot of these debates, it's more of a probability question.
Yeah, I mean, like what the kinds of debates that like Lawrence tends to judge on the national circuit. Sometimes, both debaters are like, "I have the nuclear war," and then like, of course, obviously, like, magnitude considerations aren't relevant because both sides are claiming that they, in fact, have the nuclear war and their opponent does not, or that their opponent has nuclear war and they're free of it. But yeah, and like most of the local tournaments that we're all going to, I do think that like magnitude is a relevant factor and consideration. And one thing that I just really wanted to highlight before we move on from magnitude is that, like we said in the last segment, weighing is all about spelling out your arguments. So like you have an impact. It's bad, but how bad? And tell me how bad it is. And a lot of times, debaters don't really spell out what it would mean for someone to experience their impact. I think sometimes people think of it as kind of like that, like they're telling a sob story, or that when someone is telling a sob story against them, they're like, oh my gosh, they're just trying to like persuade the judge and whatever. But in reality, a lot of the time, it's just that both debaters have impacts, and you can persuade the judge that your impact is super important, perhaps by explaining what it would be like for a real person to feel it. Does that make any sense, guys?
Definitely. I also think in terms of magnitude, a lot of people tend to just throw out impacts like extinction, and that just like what you're talking about, Martin, when you say you need to spell out the impacts, people are just like, extinction, lots of people die. But I think a better way to make this analysis is to talk about what leads up to that extinction. So, for example, like nuclear war, a lot of nuclear war debaters just like nuclear war is really bad, but because it kills everyone. But they fail to give the added analysis of how the massive amounts of suffering that occurs before people die with things like radiation, nuclear winter, water, and food shortages. And they sort of ignore or abstract away from the discussion of the massive amounts of suffering that happen before you lead to that terminal impact of extinction. And I think a lot of debaters will definitely benefit in terms of impact comparison from given a thorough analysis of what their impact implicates.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that, like, if you're going to make arguments that the other debater causes a literal physical nuclear war, right? Like, that is really bad. I mean, like, it's really, really bad. And it's not just bad because all the people die, but as you say, Nelson, it's like nuclear bombs are going off, like people's skin is melting. Like, hey, if other debater is going to spot you the fact that you get a nuclear war, you should like milk that baby for all it's worth.
Yeah.
Like,
if somebody concedes a nuclear war impact, they should lose that debate.
yeah.
I mean, one, for like conceding the impact, like you're a bad debater if you do that, and also like you just should not win a nuclear war impact and lose the round. It should just be impossible.
Yeah, like I like how would that conversation with your coach go? It's like, well, my opponent successfully I successfully won that my opponent caused a literal nuclear war, and my opponent won. Well,
You're off the team.
okay, so that's magnitude. Let's discuss probability, which Lawrence, you sort of hinted at before. So in general, what is probability?
The likelihood of any given impact occurring.
So what do you think the likelihood of us giving like $5 million more to developing countries causing nuclear war?
Pretty low.
Pretty low. So, a lot of the times, kind of weirdly, there are impacts that have a really high magnitude that are like kind of just preposterous.
Yeah, I mean,
so can you just talk about how probability plays in with those things?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the reason that I think probability is a greater consideration than magnitude is because most things in the world aren't really like that likely to happen, especially the types of things that debaters like to talk about. So like negative debaters might claim, for instance, that there is some sort of moral right of nations that they have to govern their own borders, and that violating those borders violates the sanctity and sovereignty of a nation. And without that, the entire international system is just gone. There's no basis for respecting borders anymore, and like the entire concept of a nation state goes away, and that just means like the world devolves into anarchy. And like maybe, but maybe not. And so people just get away with saying these things that, like, if they were true, would be really, really bad. But the likelihood of any of those things being true is just really, really small. And so, and on the other hand, like, there's also these very high probability impacts, these things that we do know that's going to happen, and they do have low magnitude, maybe. So, like, it's very likely that development aid will cause corruption. Like, there's actually good evidence to indicate that it does that. But is that really that big of an impact? And I mean, we'll get to this in a second, talking about the interaction between magnitude and probability, but it's really important to consider that high magnitude or high probability and low probability impacts, they play in differently into every decision.
Yeah, I mean, 100% agree. And maybe Nelson, maybe you can kind of talk about how probability is kind of like the natural check on magnitude impacts.
Yeah, probability is the natural check on magnitude impact. I think this goes back to what Lawrence said earlier about at a lot of times when you are competing at the higher level and you have really good research and really good evidence, people are probably finding the biggest impact or the biggest terminal impact. So you're usually going to have like the affirmative solves nuclear war, and then the negative also solves nuclear war. They solve like global warming, or they're saying that the affirmative causes global warming and nuclear war. Then the judge is ultimately left with the problem of, I have two extinction scenarios. How do I decide upon which to vote for or which to vote against? And then that ultimately culminates in, for the most part, probability, which has a greater likelihood of occurring if maybe nuclear war and global warming both might cause extinction theoretically, but which has a higher likelihood or high probability of occurring. And it's usually very integral to the judge's decision calculus.
100%. So what I have listed here as two different kinds of probability. Lawrence, can you kind of talk about this in like more of like a local context? So what I have here is out of round and in round. First of all, what is out of round probability?
I assume that you're referring to the likelihood of an argument that is being read and like the content of that argument being true. So the likelihood
Yeah.
of, like aid causing corruption, or the likelihood of aid being used to fund terrorism, or the likelihood of aid on the affirmative side, like bringing people out of poverty or something like that. So that'd be like the argument, the content of the arguments that you're discussing in the round.
Now, and one thing though that we're also trying to establish is that for the purpose of a debate, sometimes an argument has high probability, and that's kind of what we call in-round probability. Nelson, when does that happen? When, like, for the purpose of the debate, you consider an argument to have a high probability, quote unquote, of being true.
So, yeah. So that pretty much happens when an argument is straight conceded or not responded to.
So, so as of course having debating a lot, there's the burden of rejoinder in debate, and a judge kind of has to enforce that. If one debater makes an argument and the other debater doesn't address it, that argument is kind of just treated as being accurate for the purpose of the debate. So that's kind of like in round probability, quote unquote, because it would be one thing for the judge to just be like, I find your argument ridiculous. I mean, like, plenty of judges will do that, but they should try not to in order to avoid injecting personal bias in the decisions. So sometimes if someone's like, hey, you cause $50 trillion worth of damage, and then the other side doesn't address it, and then the other debater's like, you caused $50 trillion worth of damage. I mean, as a judge, I could be like, well, like, maybe not, and then just like vote against them. But that's really unfair to the other debaters. So I'd probably be like, yeah, sure, you can have your $50 trillion impact, whatever. So those are the two ways that you can kind of get probability. You mentioned this earlier, Lawrence. So what is the interaction between probability and magnitude? How do you figure out in general what your impact is and sort of like how it works?
Yeah, so the general way you do it is with our favorite thing ever in the world, math. So magnitude, which as we recall is scope times severity, is multiplied by probability to get you risk analysis, or scope times severity times probability. So
Is
in
risk, right?
regular words, it's like the number of people affected, the to what degree they are effective, and how likely they are to be affected equals risk.
Yeah, so that is if something is risky, right? Then that means like that is how that you would calculate that.
Right.
Sort of.
And it's like a straight up math perspective. If it's like it affects 10 people, which is the scope, it affects them by making them 10 degrees unhappy, and there is a 10% chance that that actually occurs. Just do the math, multiply it up, and then compare it to someone else's argument, which might have, for example, a scope of 20 people that's affected. They get an increase in happiness by 30 units, but there's only a 1% chance of that happening. And so you have to sort of do the comparison as to which impact, given those factors, are the ones that the judge should prioritize.
And if you know the answer to that math problem, you should send an email to the Argument Clinic podcast at gmail.com, and Lawrence will ship you one of his many computers.
I will not be doing that.
It's too late, and we've already committed to the listeners, Lawrence. You need to take one for the team and also have less computers. So
if you're willing to send us your address, which I don't know why you would, I will ship you something, but I can't guarantee it'll be good.
Whoa, that does not sound very, very promising. Nelson, do you often just give your address to random podcasts, and would you do it on the hope that they would send you something?
Oh, definitely. Knowing it's Lawrence Zhao, I'm more than certain he'd send me something absolutely amazing. So of course I would.
I've recently been researching
a box, and it would have one VBI sticker in it.
And I've recently been researching like gag gifts that you can send people, so like glitter bombs and stuff like that.
Wow, that scares me now. Remind me to not open any mail from you.
Elaborate upon why you have been researching said subject.
It's a good question.
You may not inquire about that. Okay, next.
He already did. he okay. Lawrence is evading. This is my cross-ex, Lawrence. Okay, so
if it makes you feel better, it's not directly related to you, Martin.
I'd hope not. You certainly shouldn't have my address.
Hey, Martin, what's your address?
Probably find it actually on the internet pretty easily. Forget I said that, dude.
I've been tracing all of our calls, so I can figure out where you're from.
Okay, so we got risk, and risk is kind of like the main thing that we want to do. Let's just aggregate risk back to magnitude and probability. I think the main place that kind of weighing plays out a lot of the time is between magnitude and probability. So of course, Lawrence, you can imagine, you have a 1% chance of a nuclear war. Nuclear war is super bad. Let's say 0.01%.
That's closer.
Well, it's probably still too high. But yeah, 0.01% of nuclear war. Nuclear war, super high magnitude, but extremely low probability. And then you have like the effect of development assistance on requiring government paperwork. Right? It's like government paperwork is an impact because like it increases the chances that people get paper cuts.
Leave it to Martin to come up with something like that.
It's true. I mean, like, that argument probably has 100% probability.
Paper cuts disad.
The paper cuts DA.
Is it really 100%? Because it's like if you sort of evaluate each step and assume that each step of that has like, I don't know, like even a 90% chance. Like there's like even assuming there's a 90% chance that someone gets a paper cut from filling out government paperwork, which is pretty high. I don't even think that would, if you take that across every person.
It's not literally 100%, but it is like 99.999 that someone will get one, right?
Okay, fine. One person gets one paper cut. It's probable that one person out of every 100 people that are working in the government and filling out paperwork, which by the way, if you get paper cuts while doing government paperwork, like shouldn't you get a different job? Like I feel like that's the one thing that you should be like an expert at not getting anymore. Anyways, why did I go down this rabbit hole?
Most paperwork, quote unquote, is not physically moving paper around, Lawrence.
You don't know these are poor nations. What makes you think they've come?
It's not like your literal job is to pick up paper and like walk to a different part of the company and like place it on their desk and like go back. Like that's not your job. Your job is other stuff.
Sad.
If you are a bureaucrat and you are offended by this podcast, please send an angry email to the argumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com criticizing us for our analysis. But yeah, so 99.99999% of paper cut, but like 0.00001% magnitude, right? And obviously these are like ridiculous examples, but they do kind of illustrate a fundamental conflict, which is that those impacts are still a thing, but they're also incredibly different in the metric by which that you apply. So a lot of the time, you might have to make arguments for why probability or magnitude should be a paramount consideration. And we can sort of go into that later in the next segment. Okay, so now that we've gone through risk, which is probability and magnitude, there's another thing that we have to take into account, and you could think of this as kind of like magnitude, but it also may be helpful to differentiate it. Nelson, what is duration?
Duration is pretty much the length of time that the impact lasts for. So, for example, if you had a disease impact, let's say this is absent of a terminal extinction impact, it would be essentially the duration of which that disease lasts. So if it's a cold, it would probably be a few weeks. If it's Ebola, it'd probably be until you die, which would also probably be a few weeks.
Yeah. So certainly the length of the impact. So I think that it's really clear in the case of disease, right? Like it's super clear that the length of that is literally just like the length of the time it takes the disease to like, get out of your system or just like be rid of you. In the case of like it being painful and whatever, maybe it bests you. But so let's talk about kind of like something else. So let's talk about poverty. Can you kind of explain how the duration impact would work in the sense of like you have a poverty impact, you know how bad it is, you know how likely it is. Like how does duration kind of play into that?
So I guess duration kind of plays. This kind of ties into reversibility, but I won't really get into that just because I don't want to throw like random jargon there. But an analysis that can be made about poverty, at least in comparison to other impacts, is you can say that things like poverty are more long term, and they're long term, and it's something that sticks with you for a really, really long time. But something like taxes, maybe the duration of that impact or one single tax would be insignificant in comparison to poverty because it only affects you for such a short length of time.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And I kind of want to put it in like a very specific context so that we can understand exactly how that might work. So, just in a hypothetical example, Belson, let's say that kind of poverty causes you like just being in poverty, being in the state of poverty, every day causes you to experience kind of like a bunch of short bursts of unhappiness, as well as kind of like a lingering feeling of dread, as well as feelings of sadness over like malnutrition and hunger pains and stuff like that. So let's say that you know all of that about how bad poverty is for people on a daily basis. How does duration affect then the way that you think about that impact? So like given that you know that those are the things that it will cause, that poverty causes those bad things, how does duration play into, like, in a mathematical sense, how you would think about that?
Duration would, I guess, in a mathematical sense, it would be another factor that's multiplied in the equation, because length would be the factor that's multiplied because it, I guess, in a sense, if you evaluate every single, each length of time or each segment in which that impact matters, it ultimately kind of spreads out to be more impacts in the end of the day. So that's why you would evaluate it as another factor in the multiplication.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
so for example, let's say that poverty causes me to be hungry today, and that's an impact in of itself. If that's spread across a length of 20 days, that's you would factor in 20 days into the overall impact multiplication problem, and that would ultimately, I guess, multiply the size of the impact, or the extent of the impact, or the impact of the impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And, I think that sometimes when people think about impacts, they think about them from a snapshot perspective, right? They're thinking like, well, this happens once, how bad is it? But it is incredibly relevant that that impact happens a bunch of different times. It happens more than once. So if malnutrition is bad, not like, obviously, if you just look at the impact of malnutrition on one individual at one point in time, maybe, I mean, it's bad, but it's not horrible. But then if you multiply that by 20 years, right, that is a huge impact.
Definitely.
Even if it might be small, if you looked at it at just one point in time, the fact that it just keeps happening over and over again, it's certainly a thing. So that's another thing to add to the theoretical risk equation that we're doing. You take the risk of the impact, the probability, and the magnitude, and you multiply it by how often, what is the length of that impact. And one way of thinking about it is like, what duration does is it takes impacts and it repeats them. It says, what if that impact happened every single day? So it is quantity of times that risk analysis sort of plays out. And okay, kind of get on to like practical stuff in the third segment. So I think those guys are really the most kind of prolific, important ways of weighing that people do in debate. So I want to talk about three more types that are less common, but that are still pretty important. So Lawrence, first of all, are you still alive?
Barely.
Barely. Good answer. I want to ask you about time frame weighing. What is that, and why is it important?
Yeah, so time frame weighing is just how soon the impacts will occur, and all else being equal, an impact that happens faster or sooner than another impact should be given higher weight in the judge's priority of when they're trying to decide which argument matters.
Okay, so why actually is time frame important?
Well, few reasons. First, I mean, generally speaking, it just kind of sucks when something happens quick. And like I just generally assume that it's much worse if I get sick now than sick later. But the second thing is that
Why?
it reduces.
Why?
Well, I don't know. Like I'd just rather not. Like, eh. But I think the sort of reasoning that you're trying to get to is related to a probability question, which is um, if something happens sooner, there is less chance that we can stop that problem from occurring in the first place, whereas something that takes longer to get to is more likely to be resolved by some other consideration. So if I get sick now versus sick later, the reason it's worse to get sick now is because it definitively happens. Like I will get sick and it'll probably last longer and suck and whatever. But if it happens in the future, then it increases the chance that we can do something about it and solve the problem in the future. So when comparing two impacts, something that happens sooner is much more likely to happen versus something that happens later, which is less likely to happen.
Yeah. I agree, and I think the time frame weighing is a little weird for this reason. That it is really like a probability question. Um, although I do think that impacts now probably matter more than impacts later, but like Nelson, like I don't know, like does it? Like why? I've never really been able to figure out why.
It definitely does. And I think this goes back to what Lawrence was talking about earlier. The more, I guess, debate jargony term would be intervening actors. This is just the idea that when an impact happens, at a later time, the probability or the chance of some actor intervening and preventing the action is greater than if it happens sooner. And I guess to go back to your analysis of like probability and time frame, I definitely do think that there is an implicit sort of relationship between time frame and probability. Because if you think about it as I guess as probability increases, so as I mean, I guess as time frame increases, so the sort of the probability of it occurring in terms of your evidence of like the impact. So for example, if I have really, really solid evidence about global warming that says that global warming is real, it's anthropogenic, and it's going to cause extinction. That's most likely because we are in close proximity to that impact happening. So you usually will definitely always see like a positive correlation between probability and time frame.
100%. So I think that if you wanted to make a time frame argument, that is exactly how you would make it. It needs to be kind of a relative probability question as well. Now, Nelson, you actually mentioned this before about reversibility. Can you just say quickly what that is?
Sure, that is simply the extent to which your impact is able to be reversed. So, for example, when talking about an extinction scenario, an extinction impact, you would say that extinction isn't really reversible because you can't really kill everyone and then bring everyone back to life. That's not really how things work for the most part. But
For the most part,
I mean, people definitely do have their beliefs that differ, but yeah, for the most part, you can't really kill everything, or everything can't really die and then come back to life. So extinction would be an impact that you would say is not reversible or it's irreversible. But then an impact like poverty or racism can be reversed because similar to how you can put people in a position of poverty, you can also take them out of poverty. So in terms of the impact comparison or the applicability to the round, you usually want to say that you would usually want to say that irreversible impacts should be prioritized because you can't really do things about it. So you would say something along the lines of, hey, extinction is irreversible, thus it should come prior to evaluating impacts like poverty because you can reverse those.
yeah, exactly. And do people like really make this argument very much? Like, I think they do in more kind of local contexts. But like, but like, hmm, what do you all think about reversibility weighing arguments? Just like either of you, I'm kind of like not a fan.
I guess they're only really, I don't necessarily know if reversibility should be the bread and butter of your Wayne arguments, but it should be something to couple or to supplement other Wayne arguments. So when having I guess an analysis of like time frame, you may be able to say something that you should prefer impacts that happen in a closer proximity because there are more irreversible but long-term impacts that rely on sort of like a break. So things like global warming are reversible, so they should come after you prioritize some other impact.
And Lawrence, what do you think?
It's just an argument. It's very rarely does it make or
Lawrence
break a
with the
debate.
hot take.
Yeah, it just like very rarely makes or breaks a debate. So like, who cares?
All right. I'm apathetic towards it. Too. Okay. The next one we'll talk about for longer, but it is this one is the reason that we're not going to talk about it for very long is that it is actually very similar to other arguments that a lot of you already know how to make. So basically, one way of arguing that your impact is preferable to your opponents is that it causes your opponents.
Or maybe not causes, but worsens, amplifies, magnifies. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's like cause, but whatever they say, it makes it worse.
Yeah, I personally, maybe this can be a point of disagreement, Lawrence. I do believe that that you could say that it magnifies their impacts and makes it worse, but I do believe that for the purpose of most of these weighing arguments, it really does come down to causes. A lot of
Okay, fair enough.
From like a logical perspective. So one of the easiest ways to think about this is in terms of the relationship between poverty and terrorism. So you can make easy arguments on both sides of the equation why poverty has a relationship with terrorism that is not just that it's bigger, but that it also kind of relates to the impact of terrorism. So for actually, rather than poverty and terrorism, let's take a topical example. Let's talk about poverty and government corruption.
Yeah, that was the one I was going to use.
So poverty and terrorism is actually the one that I use like outside of the context of like just not related to the topic when I'm trying to teach people weighing. But actually, it turns out we have a topical example. So poverty versus corruption. So if you are in poverty, people if people are in poverty, the more likely their governments are to probably like be corrupt because the incentives for it are pretty high. I think that kind of makes sense. I'm not sure whether it's statistical, but I would be surprised if it wasn't. And then but also you can make the opposite argument. You can say that in fact, if people are more corrupt, they are also more likely to impoverish their people because they don't care about them. Now, the effect of this argument is that if you win your impact, their impact is kind of neutralized because it's non-unique. And the reason that I say that this argument is similar to the thing that a lot of you see already is that you all are very familiar by now with prerequisite arguments. You say you say it all the time. You say my criterion is a prerequisite to yours. So one way of this kind of builds into that logic, take those same mental muscles that you already have and apply them to saying that, in fact, if you have poverty, they can't have their impact either. So if both sides have poverty, then really poverty is not important to either side. Nelson, Lawrence, do you all have anything to add about this? I kind of don't want to spend that much time on it, but if you have anything, particularly important to add, you should go ahead and do so.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to add that this can, unlike the previous argument, really make or break debates. Like if it's, if both of you are winning, that your impacts are probable and are of sufficient magnitude for me to care about, well, the more that you explain the interaction between what happens in your world and from your impact and relate it to your opponents, the much easier it is for the judge to give a decision that's in your favor. And it's especially important because most of these things are intricately related to each other, like not just with this poverty corruption example, because like those things are obviously intricately related, but think about a more common negative argument like aid dependency. Like aid dependency and poverty are very closely related together. And the reason why aid dependency is a good argument is because a lot of authors writing about it will talk about how aid dependency actually increases poverty, right? And so thinking about the relationship between those two things is a really easy way for the judges to say, like, yeah, this is why I voted one way or the other.
Yeah, and just to
Yeah.
add to that,
Yeah, go ahead.
I pretty much was going to say that same exact thing. Just, I guess, an advice to the younger debaters out there: whenever you can make a turns case argument or a turns to dissent argument, which is pretty much what we've been talking about for the past few minutes, you should always definitely try to do that. Always, 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 because if you're essentially proving that your impact is not only bad but also pretty much causes their impact, that's pretty much like double impacts for you.
Double impact, double the fun. All right, so when we get back to the next segment, we're going to talk about how to specifically implement these weighing arguments and how you should take all of that content that we just told you and put it in your debate rounds. In this third segment, we're going to talk about how you should use all these weighing stuff that we talked about during the round. And before we go into how you do them specifically, what I want to make clear to you was we just gave you a whole bunch of different stuff to think about when weighing impacts. The important thing to realize about all of that is that we're trying to get you to think about arguments in sort of logical and precise ways. That's what we're doing. We're, as Nelson said towards the beginning of the episode, weighing has a kind of like natural process to it. And the reason that it does that is not because debaters just decided that it would, but that's just what makes sense in terms of thinking about how bad things are. So take these things: probability, magnitude, risk, duration, time frame, reversibility, and just when you look at an impact, try and think about it in those terms. And once you do that, all these impacts that look like very similar, or that you feel like you couldn't compare them, or that you wouldn't want to, will all of a sudden become like much more easy to understand, much more easy to parse, and you can kind of pick them apart. And when your opponent presents an impact, you can point out the weaknesses of their impact on the basis of one of these things. So the most important thing, based on all the stuff that we're telling you when you implement it, is not that you implement it in the exact same way that we told you to implement it. The important thing is that you realize what your impact is, that you realize why your impact is bad, and that you figure out how to look at impacts so that you can then make arguments about it in the debate. So that's my passionate spiel to you. Lawrence, Nelson, do you all have any hot fire you'd like to add, or was that sufficiently burning?
Burning.
I think that was
Burning, yes.
pretty scorching.
Scorching. I love that word. I'm gonna use it a lot now. Maybe not necessarily on the podcast, but I'm just gonna definitely use that word to my debaters. Scorching. It's so great. I love the word scorch. It's awesome. You're great. So in general, how do you word a weighing argument in a debate round, Lawrence? If I wanted to say just to the average judge that my argument outweighed theirs, what is the best way to put that without confusing the judge?
Well, I'm not sure if there's like a best way, but I can say that the number one, I think, mistake that people do when they're sort of doing weighing is being too scripted or too robotic sounding. And they're just using these terms: magnitude, scope, severity, probability, time frame, etc., without really explaining them. And so like I'm not even sure, like, and feel free to disagree with me, any of you. But like, I'm of the opinion that in most of these local rounds, it doesn't really make that much sense to say the words magnitude, probability, etc. Instead, sort of contextualize it, especially in the last speeches, to specifically the argument that is being read here. So that you're debating against. So like, take the poverty affirmative argument versus the corruption negative argument on this development assistance topic. Instead of just being like, poverty outweighs corruption, one is magnitude, more people die as a result of it, two is and like yeah, and like two is probability. It's pretty probable that people are dying. Like I think it should be like you should be willing to accept a limited increase in government corruption for the purposes of saving hundreds of thousands of people who are suffering as the result of poverty. And like that gets you, or who are like actually dying right now as a result of systemic poverty that can be easily solved with development assistance. And I think that gets you the same scope, severity, and probability arguments without using these buzzwords and really more explaining it to the context of your argument relative to your opponents.
Mm-hmm. And if you had to give some basic tips, Nelson, what would you do? Some some
So
some some general stuff.
I definitely do agree with what Lawrence had to say. I guess my only, not necessarily an objection, but only thing I want to add to that is that in more fast-paced debates, or when you're debating on a national circuit, you're really pressed for time, and word economy and efficiency is really key. So you still want to sort of follow the guideline or the framework that Lawrence just kind of gave, but just kind of simplify that and do it in a more economical, or word economical, manner. So the way I like to think about this, and this goes for every argument, as you've heard all the time, you present arguments with a claim, a warrant, and an impact. So in terms of, let's say you are in the national circuit and you there really isn't a disadvantage to using jargon. I would say that the sort of most efficient way, if you're doing it, and if you're making analysis on a specific weighing metric like magnitude, you would say something along the lines of, so you would have a claim, which would be like the disad outweighs on magnitude. That's your claim, and then you'd give a more or an explanation for that. So it would sound something along the lines of, more people will be affected and will die from a nuclear war that culminates in extinction, as opposed to an increase in taxes, or an increase in taxes in the United States. And then you should sort of give the impact or the implication of that by tying it to maybe a broader Freeman argument. So for example, if it is let's say that both the debaters have agreed that it's sort of a policy-making round, and they've sort of conceded the Wohler evidence that says that state actors have to act in certain ways. Maybe you might maybe add an analysis that says that you've conceded the Wohler evidence that says that state governments have to maximize the benefits of the constituents and act in certain ways, which means that you have to prioritize an analysis of magnitude. That would be sort of a way that you make the argument in round.
Mm-hmm. So all that said, if I wanted to argue that my impact outweighed on magnitude, how would I say that, Lawrence?
I mean, if you wanted to use the term, you could just literally be like, "Yeah, my argument outweighs on magnitude. I save 400,000 lives while only sacrificing like 20 for the because of government corruption," or something like that.
It's usually not as clear cut with respect to
certainly not. It'd be more like 400,000 people dying is a greater consideration in your ethical calculus than a slight increase in government corruption that has limited effects upon people and doesn't cause any of them to die. And like that might be a magnitude weighing argument.
So let's say that I'm going to kind of like zoom out for a sec. Let's say, of course, that you do not have a statistic about number of people that would die. But
Okay,
you still but you still want to make a weighing argument. How would you go about doing that? Let's say that you just said that the economy was better. Like how would you go about making a general weighing argument against something like corruption?
Right. So like a tangible increase in the GDP of an economy boosts the welfare and lived experiences of those inside the economy much more than tangible or much more than like improbable slight increases in corruption, which only have a chance of affecting a very limited amount of people in a very limited way. I don't know. Like it's a little bit hard to do in a vacuum.
So you threw in some probability stuff there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like I don't really know what the impact of corruption is in this example, so it's a little bit hard to do the comparison. But just like people dying as a result of like poverty and like a real increase in the overall welfare of people in the economy seems to be a much more important consideration in terms of magnitude than I don't know, like what is even the impact of corruption? Like like makes aid a little bit less useful? Like I don't really know.
There's some stuff that, like, government corruption encourages like terrorist stuff, and that it encourages governments to kind of ignore the plight of their citizens, which exacerbates poverty.
Oh, yeah, okay. Maybe an argument like dependency or something would be easier to do comparison for, because it's like dependency is kind of nebulous. It doesn't like, and you should be willing to like make yourself slightly dependent on someone if it means that like it overall improves the economy of a nation or something like that.
Yeah, okay. I think that makes sense, and I'm also going to agree with the thing that you said earlier, that you don't necessarily need to say it outweighs on magnitude. You just kind of like spell out the impact in a way that is not flattering to it, in their case of their impact, in a way that is for yours. And you may need to build some connections, and weighing maybe requires you to make arguments. Oh, one thing that we should probably mention that we like haven't mentioned before, Nelson. If you have the choice between weighing in your first speech and weighing in the second speech, which one should you do?
In Lincoln Douglas debate, definitely in the first speech, you want to do a little bit of preemptive weighing. Well, I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by first speech and second speech, because there's
Why
usually.
don't I just why don't I just save you there by being like, yeah, it's the first speech.
I mean, yeah, sure. You definitely want to do a little bit of preemptive weighing in the former speech, like in an earlier speech and then a later speech.
So maybe this is what you're asking about. Like, of course you can put weighing arguments in the affirmative case, and you kind of should, but you won't know exactly what their impact is. Is that kind of what you're saying about how it's like preemptive?
Uh, if so, I guess the way uh to clarify this is if an impact comparison has the potential or like the ability to be made in that speech, it should be made in that speech. So, for example, you wouldn't really be able to do that comparison in the affirmative speech because you don't really know what you're comparing it against. I mean, in the affirmative constructive,
Right.
but in the 1AR, after the negatives impact has been introduced, you would want to start your analysis then.
Yeah, I just definitely agree. You should weigh early and often, and the first time that you have the ability to compare impacts, you should do that. Because if your opponent does not, Lawrence, like if you're judging and someone makes a weighing argument and the other debater fails to address it, um, don't you just like it's like your brain is just like, oh, okay, this decision will be easy now.
Oh yeah. If someone in like the first speech is like puts all of these preemptive weighing arguments in the first negative rebuttal against this affirmative case, and the 1AR fails to deal with like any of them, it just like it makes the decision just so much easier. Just like, yeah, you've conceded that like the negatives impacts are like much more probable than yours, and yep, I voted egg.
Yep, I voted neg has been called. Um, so now that we've gone through weighing arguments in a very general sense in terms of like how you would make them, starting with you, Nelson, I kind of want to talk about magnitude. What is the best way to think about spelling out magnitude for a judge? For me, it would kind of have to do with like just kind of discussing the like lives of the people, how many of them there are, like, but like I'm interested in your perspective. How would you go about taking the magnitude of your argument and spelling it out in very explicit terms why it's more?
So
Lawrence like kind of already did it, but I'm interested in hearing what you have to say.
So I guess this would go back to what I said, like in the beginning of this podcast, about it being a multiplication problem between scope and severity. I think, like I said, a lot of people tend to only focus on the scope of which it affects individuals without focusing on the severity. I think in terms of in terms of pathos, it really helps. Gives not necessarily like you should be focused on like affective appeals, but it really makes the argument a bit clearer for the judge when you explain the intricacies of the impact in terms of the severity as well as the scope to which it affects individuals.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's great, and we've like mostly already already talk about it. I think duration is pretty straightforward. You would just say this impact will occur years and years and years, and it will compound. Poverty lasts for a long time. One of the things that you were talking about earlier, Nelson, is kind of like the potential impacts to something like the criminal justice system being bad, or mass incarceration and stuff like that. And of course, you have access to arguments there about duration and the effect that it affects multiple generations of people, and etc.
Definitely.
So definitely that, and for probability, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but like I feel like a lot of probability is just kind of like throwing shade at your opponent's impact. Kind of just like, that's not gonna happen. Like, really? Like I feel like that's kind of a lot of what it is, at least when you're impugning the probability of their impact.
Yeah, I guess that's a simple way to put it. It is throwing shade at the impact, maybe a little bit more warranted. Maybe a little bit more warranted.
Hopefully.
Like, it's not going to happen.
I'm sure that debaters have won rounds on worse weighing arguments than the one I just gave. Where you're just like, yeah, that impact, just like get rid of it. I know that, for example, when I judge like novice rounds, or on the occasional rare time I have to judge a public forum debate, usually the person that wins is the person who comes the closest to making a weighing argument, which is not to say the person that made the best weighing argument, but just the thing that they said, which, if twisted enough, could be construed as a weighing argument. Who came the closest to doing that will win. And a lot of the case probability is like, my impact is really probable, yours is not. One way to establish probability is to establish that that the impacts that you're discussing are happening now, whereas their impacts are quote unquote speculative. Lawrence, I assume that you see this argument a lot as a judge.
Yes, actually, it's actually kind of an annoying argument, because people say it without contextualizing it. They'll just be like, you should vote negative because I have guaranteed harms where they have only speculative benefits. And like, that argument, I guess, is okay in a vacuum, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, if your guaranteed harm is like one person gets a pinprick, and their like speculative benefit is they save like 100 lives, like, I know which side I'm siding with every single time. So like, I don't know, that argument is only useful if it's like contextualized to like things that were said in round.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. And I, of course, like you, have judged many debates where people have executed this argument poorly. But I don't think that means that the argument is bad. I just think
no,
that, like,
no. Yeah,
people will like, because I think a lot of the time people are like, my opponent's impacts are speculative, but my impacts are concrete, when in reality there's just literally no difference
right. And
between their impacts. And so in that sense, it's annoying. But like, of course, Lawrence, you would agree that if the affirmative is like, these impacts are occurring now because they are literally occurring now.
Right.
They're occurring now.
I'm not saying it's a bad argument. I'm just saying that people deploy it incorrectly because they only take it the first step. I actually think that it's a really well phrased argument, and that, especially in front of judges who judge more locally, if you're like, you should not allow a guaranteed harm for rights for only a speculative benefit in the long term that may not even materialize. Like, that, it sounds good. It's just the problem is that people don't really take it and contextualize it to what the guaranteed harms are versus what the speculative benefits are.
100% agree. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to do was to talk about drills. Drills that you and your squad can do to improve at weighing. Weighing is a skill that decides most of the debates that you will probably compete in your life. So it is really worth your time to invest some practices and after school meetings with fellow debate people into thinking about how you might go about weighing and improving those skills to the core. One of the things that I do is with my kids is that we kind of give them impacts that they don't choose, and then we force them to make weighing arguments about them. So that's what I do. That thing is pretty easy. You just kind of generate a list of consequences, and then you force them. Then you give them a side, much in the same way that debate, you don't get to choose your side. They don't get to choose their side for this. You assign them a side, and then you make them duke it out. So that kind of forces them to think of like various arguments for it. And another one is we do it with like kinds of weighing. I'll be like, hey, you're saying magnitude is more important. You say probability is more important. And they're like, who, me? Because they're eighth graders. And then I'll be like, okay, yes, you person, now like think of some arguments. And like that kind of forces them into like getting into a good headspace. Um, Another activity that I do with my kids is just to like take an impact that they think that they, especially with younger kids, that they think that they know how bad it is, and have them like write a long paragraph detailing exactly how bad it is in every single situation. Just like kind of like almost even like write an essay about the impact that they don't really explain how bad it is, and just like, no, like, yeah, I understand it's disease, right? But I want you to spell out exactly who it's bad for and all the time. And take as much space as you want to kind of just get them into the thought space where they think about how big that their impact is. And this is a drill you can do by yourself. Just kind of explicate it, really just draw out the impacts. Lawrence, what do you do with your kids?
So the impact tournament is really common where you just, assign people a long list of impacts and make them debate it out. In the novice lab that I taught at VBI this summer, I made them debate about ridiculous things like the consequence of working at Amazon because it kind of sucks to work there in one of their warehouses versus a possible increase in violence as a result of too many video games being played or whatever, and just made them debate about that. I also like to do these real world hypotheticals, and so what they will be are like just things that you would like have to debate about in sort of an everyday sort of context, and make them debate about it without using jargon. So like one example might be like, which car should you buy, and debate between like the fuel economy versus the leg room versus the comfort versus the price, and sort of have to figure out which one is more important. Or maybe instead debate about like which university someone should go to, and list out a bunch of hypotheticals and constraints in that. So like maybe one university is closer and one university costs less, and things like that, and forcing people to sort of debate about these sort of real world intricacies that aren't like cut and dry, like nuclear war is worse than warming or something like that. It really forces them to think about all of the things that surround a real world circumstance, and debate about that. Other than that, I think like the rest of it is just like redoing speeches in which people forgot to weigh, and then like forcing them to actually weigh in these redos.
Yeah, like gosh darn it, weigh. Nelson, what now I know that you weigh a lot. You must have. You're doing pretty well in debate.
You weigh a lot sounds like a dig at someone's like weight, but
no, it kind of does. That's not what I mean.
Martin, did you just roast me?
Well, like definitely, if I had actually said that, Nelson would just be like, link turn, obviously, and I'd be like, oh yeah. Yeah, I would definitely lose on the link turn if I went for the you weigh a lot DA. Not even true at all, and definitely getting myself. Let's just say I'd be getting myself into some trouble there. But what do you think debaters should do to improve at the activity of weighing?
So I mean, pretty much everything you all have said was what I was going to say. In terms of the mini impact tournament, I think it's good to give them sort of similar impact. So, for example, somebody might have like China-Russian war, and another person has Israeli-Palestine war, and that forces them to sort of like debate the intricacies of these impacts. And then another example would be like biodiversity loss versus climate change, because there's room for things like turns case arguments. And it's just very similar. It really forces them to debate the intricacies of said impacts. I think rebuttal redos definitely help a lot. Maybe instead of doing like the entire rebuttal, you might just like find a segment of where the Wayne argument was, and sort of calculate how long you can probably. One thing I used to do as a debater when I do drills is I think how long do I optimally want to take to make this argument or to give this part of the rebuttal, and then I'd set that time apart, and then try to give that part of the rebuttal within that time frame, and maybe like decrease the time to figure out how you can say that in a faster manner or a more efficient manner. But yeah, pretty much everything that Lawrence and Martin have said so far are very, very good ways to improve your weighing ability.
All right, sounds like we're good. So when we return, we'll have the only important segment of our podcast, the mini debate. Well, thank you, Nelson, for coming on our podcast. You've been an absolutely great guest, and we've absolutely really appreciated coming on, especially on such short notice.
Thank you. I definitely enjoyed doing this, and I would look forward to doing this maybe another time in the future. I appreciate the invite.
Awesome, great. You know, stick around. You're going to be a part of the mini debate, of course. One quick note before we do that. Well, a couple of quick notes. First, please like our page on Facebook. We have a Argument Clinic podcast page. That'll be the quickest way to know when new episodes come out. Please go to SoundCloud and check out all of our old episodes, or on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's a ton of really good old episodes on evidence comparison, judge adaptation, drills, all sorts of great stuff. And there's even one on the current resolution. If you are listening to this on December 2017. You should also please email us at the Argument Clinic Podcast at gmail.com with any questions related to anything that we talked about, questions for activities, questions, suggestions for topics of things that we would do. Please email us. We're desperate for your feedback. We obviously have plenty of guests and topics to work on, but we really are trying to serve you all, the community. So if you all decide that your squad really is has deficits in some areas, you should definitely reach out to us, and we can do our best to ensure that we get those things on the podcast. Lastly, thank you to Victory Briefs for sponsoring the podcast. Again, you all are great. They help keep the lights on, and they're just an absolutely excellent camp that you all should patronize. Okay, now the mini debate. So I was wondering what you all thought about the best comic, like comic book, or like style of comic, or like thing, or like, comic that people write. Because I was just thinking about this the other day, because there are a lot of written comics or web comics that I really enjoy. So I think that this would be a good topic for debate. So I think that there's like an obviously really good one, so I'm not going to shotgun it, and I'll let Lawrence go first, or Nelson if Nelson, if you already have an answer.
I would say mangas are the best comics because they are very I guess it's very intricate. The sort of content that they have usually differs, because the world of like Japanese like anime and mangas, it's very, very diverse and lots of different contents to talk about.
Strong suggestion.
Also, it's just very neat that you have to read from right to left instead of left to right. So it's very, I guess, unique and different from the stereotypical comic.
That's fair. Funnily enough, I actually never even experienced that as weird, because that is how like Hebrew prayer books and stuff were read. So weird that just like didn't quite impact me as much. Lawrence, what is your submission?
I feel like I'm the type of person that ought to read comic books, but I don't, because reading is hard. So
I they don't have to be like comic books necessarily, but it's just like, like comic strips.
Oh, comic strips. Oh, that's so easy.
Yeah.
Calvin and Hobbes for me. That's like the only like set of comic strips that I've just ever read from front to back. Actually, I kind of want to buy myself the complete Calvin and Hobbes collection for Christmas, because no one else will buy me it. So
oh no.
Well, I mean, like, I'm going for like real gifts for my parents, like, if they want to help pay for like my phone, like that's great. So I can't really.
So then you just take the money that you saved and just like buy yourself a comic book.
Okay, look, I'm not like good at budgeting. Like every like cent that
You have 4 computers.
yeah, doesn't that just prove my
That's
point?
why. Yeah,
That just
I know.
proves my point.
I'm
Yeah,
agreeing with you.
yeah.
Um,
So, but
um,
yes, Calvin Hobbes is great. It's just
so
like
I
childhood embodied.
So yeah, I did not select. I did not go first because I knew that Lawrence would snap up Calvin and Hobbes. So I can go either way on this one. I want you all to persuade me. So Lawrence, make your case for Calvin and Hobbes versus manga.
Well, I mean, like if you're into manga, you're into it. Like you're involved in like this horribly detailed world that has, you know, fantasy and characters and like it just so detailed and so intricate and it really sucks you in into this fantasy. Whereas I think Calvin and Hobbes is just like, you know, it's relatable to basically anyone that's gone through childhood and it really brings about that sort of childhood sense of wonder and like, you know, for those that are into manga, you're into it, and that's, you know, that's cool. I just don't have like the time, interest, or brain power to do it, so that's why Calvin and Hobbes is good for me.
All right, Nelson.
Oh wait, should we do like weighing here? Like, should we like say like magnitude,
Yeah, dude.
probability?
You have to persuade me if you just
Right.
like
Okay. So
you were just about to auto lose to Nelson.
okay, so the first argument is sort of accessibility, and this outweighs on scope and severity. So scope, because that means more people get to read this comic without having to be too invested. Severity, because accessibility is the sort of determinant for whether or not something is a good work of media, or is like is good. Because otherwise, if people don't read it, then what's the enjoyability? It definitely outweighs on probability. I know this accessibility argument outweighs on probability because more people definitely have read Calvin and Hobbes versus any given piece of manga. Let's see. Second benefit is childhood wonder. That outweighs on magnitude because it really relates to the part of you that was developing while growing up. Whereas like manga helps you relate to like your older self, but that's, you know, who cares about that relative to this development of your like inner child and like that sort of sense of creativity, wonder, exploration, fantasy that gets destroyed when you get older. And it outweighs on probability because I'm sure like there's actually like people have written articles about like Calvin and Hobbes and its relationship to childhood wonder. I could go on, but I'm pretty sure I'm wasting my time at this point.
You've distracted the judge from making too many arguments.
Yeah.
Nelson just needs to persuade me, and he's good to go.
Alrighty. So Lawrence has fundamentally conceded the argument that mangas are very different and unique, and they have different types of manga, which means that we necessarily outweigh on magnitude because it appeals to a broader audience since they have the people who read manga have a wide variety of options to choose from. So it definitely appeals. Whereas Calvin and Hobbes is just a story about a boy with a tiger, and if you're not really into that, you don't really have that many options. So we definitely outweigh on scope. Also, severity. Calvin and Hobbes can't potentially get that deep, but lots of mangas really have a sort of emotional investment, which outweighs on severity because the affective appeal to the individual is definitely a lot more than Calvin and Hobbes. Additionally, Lawrence makes the argument that Calvin and Hobbes is relatable. How many of you all grew up with a pet tiger? None. So that fundamentally disproves this argument. It's very simple. It's a manga ballot, vote manga.
That was good. I'm gonna give Lawrence no time for rebuttals. But I'll kind of like construct our rebuttal in my head because I know personally, Nelson, that I've never been a sort of blue-haired magic wielder pirate ninja. so you know, maybe the like relatability and that's like, but you know, whatever. I don't know. I really like both of these things, although I personally do not read manga because reading is not my thing. I'm certainly the target audience for it, and look at animes on occasion, infrequently, but I do. I think I'm gonna go. I don't know. This one's really hard because like Calvin and Hobbes is definitely more like relatable, accessible, but also like manga's like definitely more like complicated and deep and intricate.
Yeah, see, this proves the point of weighing, because both of those arguments are true. So it's just which one do you care about more? Leave it up to the listeners, because I don't think there's a clear answer at this point.
I'll leave it up to the well, actually, no, screw you, Lawrence. I'm gonna choose manga.
Okay, fair enough.
Although I will say that I've almost certainly read more Calvin and Hobbes than I have manga, but I'm going to go for manga. But if the listeners just think that I'm completely wrong, they should email me at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com or send Lawrence a number of angry messages about how dare he not like manga, or send us a bunch of emails that just contain the word nerd in all caps with like 50 E's at my ability to select manga. Okay. So that's the only segment of our podcast that actually matters, the mini debate. It does prove the importance of weighing for those of you that are still around. Now, Nelson, we have a thing at the end of this podcast where our guest signs off by saying "Stay frosty." So could you just say that kind of like that, like really emphasize the A, be like "Stay frosty."
All right, the argument clinic. It's been thrill. Stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.